District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Since we held our interview with Mandy Gunasekara, President-elect Trump has announced who his 3 top natural resources and energy cabinet heads are of the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of the Interior, and Energy Department. It'll be Lee Zeldin, former New York congressman to helm the EPA, current but outgoing governor of North Dakota, Doug Burgum, to head the Department of Interior and also the newly formed National Energy Council. And announced over the weekend is Chris Wright, who is going to helm the Department of Energy and also work with Governor Burgum to oversee this National Energy Council. We're going to break down these 3 nominees, this new National Energy Council, what they all mean. I'm grateful at least that these 3 cabinet picks are pretty standard and not controversial. When you look at it, I would hate to be my friends in other policy areas because some of them were dealt some interesting potential cabinet nominees. Let's start with EPA in terms of how these nominees were announced, because it was first EPA, then Interior, then Energy. So literally within a few hours of publishing Mandy's interview here on the podcast and also on YouTube, President Trump announced that he was going to go with former New York Congressman Lee Zeldin, who was also a 2022 gubernatorial Republican nominee who narrowly lost New York State that year. His selection was kind of peculiar to EPA insiders, nothing sort of out of the ordinary. He is a lawyer, which is very important because most of the people who helm EPA as EPA administrator typically are lawyers. He doesn't really have a traditional energy environmental portfolio, so maybe that is why some people were initially shocked by his selection, but it wasn't because they thought he was unqualified. They thought his portfolio of issues and interest areas have slightly deviated from these issues, or he may not have had a particular focus. From what I could preen from his time in Congress, he did participate in a couple things like some climate caucus and a couple other things. And he has a lifetime score from the League of Conservation Voters, or the League of Preservation Voters, as I like to say, of a 16% lifetime score. So to me, that sounds great. He was largely against a lot of the far left environmental platitudes in his time in Congress. I don't see him being a fanboy of net zero, which is good to me. And so when you think of his kind of lack of experience in the EPA, or someone who didn't really work litigating environmental or energy issues, it does seem a little bit peculiar. But Mandy said his selection was amazing. And if you get someone's seal of approval like that, I think you're in pretty good hands. Other EPA folks from the first Trump administration did not have any qualms with his selection. So I think a lot of people, just of course, if they're in support of President-elect Trump's administration and his goals and agenda, they don't see anything wrong with this pick. And again, there's no really big alarm bells for Lee Zeldin helming the EPA. Mr. Zeldin's going to have a big task on his hand, getting the EPA back to its mission statement. And I'm going to say this of all the 3 agencies because all 3 agencies under Biden-Harris have strayed from their mission and have put things like DEI, climate alarmism, environmental, social, and governance platitudes well before clean air, clean water, hunting as a management tool, the like. We've talked about this for 4 years here on the podcast. I've talked about this at great length. So these agencies have been politically captured by radicals for the last 4 years. So Zeldin and the other 2 are going to have to clean up big time. And here's what I mean in terms of cleaning up the EPA. The EPA has been encumbered by a lot of Inflation Reduction Act money. You're seeing all this superfluous spending for environmental justice grants, which 90 some odd percent of that does not go to actually addressing so-called inequities in minority communities. It goes to overhead and pay. 96% of that, as Senator Chuck Grassley discovered in his research and investigation into this, money is wasted. EPA under Biden-Harris did not respect property rights whatsoever. They were proposing a New Waters of the United States rule. They did not help with the cleanup of East Palestine. They finalized so-called tailpipe emissions rules, which is a nice-sounding way of saying electric vehicle mandates, which is what they are for light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles. So your standard sedan to commercial vehicles. His EPA, Biden-Harris's EPA, put us back into the ineffective and costly and wasteful Paris Climate Accords. And even people who are climate champions, so to speak, don't believe that COP or the United Nations, this COP conference in Baku, is not really helping them. And a lot more people, oil companies, those who've been captured again by this net zero promise, are starting to peel back their support. Back to the EPA, what else does Lee Zeldin have to do? So he has to kind of rebuild trust with the agency and the American public, because this agency had strayed so far off the deep end, kind of like interior and energy as well. You're going to see deregulation, a lot of rules that were created, the power plant rule, CPP 2.0, the Clean Power Plan rule, that has got to go. And I think Zeldin will get rid of that, because that basically says that existing coal plants and new natural gas plants can only exist and thrive if they promise to reduce their emissions by X amount of percent and then install carbon capture technology, which is not fully realized yet. That is a rule we're going to be watching for. This repealing of this really obtuse methane emissions rule that was just finalized. A couple energy efficiency rules that fell under the bucket of EPA, although most of those are going to Department of Energy. A couple of those standards will be hopefully revoked. You'll see this path of deregulation like you saw under the first Trump EPA. And as I stress here, deregulation is not going to lead to decimation. You're still going to see clean air, clean water. You'll see even Superfund cleanups. One thing that a lot of people did not know about the EPA, as Mandy had talked about last week, is that they actually took a so-called lefty environmental issue, made it their own, and actually brought solutions to Superfund cleanups that even Obama's EPA could not even deliver on. So there are going to be some very noteworthy things under the EPA. If I think it's going to be going in the direction it is, if you look to the past Trump EPA, under Zeldin, he hopefully will enlist the help of some deputies who have worked in the EPA. I know everyone's like, you got to totally drain the swamp. And absolutely, there's a lot of holdovers and people who are going to try to undermine all these three agencies from within. But at EPA, since I think Zeldin has probably the least experience dealing with this set of issues, he's going to need some people from the first Trump EPA who are loyal, granted, whatever, or at least know the lay of the land to help him be successful at this, because it's so entrenched with people who have just mucked up the mission statement. And so he's going to need good people there, because that is one of the agencies that have been encumbered by so much politicization, needs to have trust restored, and so much more. Let's move on to the selection of Governor Doug Burgum. So a lot of people assumed that the North Dakota governor, who is finishing up his term, he's term limited, he's not running for re-election, he was going to have some position in the Trump administration. I initially thought it was going to be the Energy Department position that he was going to be awarded for his loyalty, for being, cordial with President Trump, not really picking a fight or battle with him whatsoever. The interior selection is interesting. It was not out of left field. I was thinking it was going to be Alaska Governor Dunleavy. I don't really have any personal knowledge into the decision-making that is happening at Mar-a-Lago. Nobody's feeding me information. But what you can surmise from some of Trump's picks, especially in these natural resources and energy positions, he's not going with people as cabinet heads who were previously cabinet heads. You see this across the Secretary of State picks and other areas too. But so far, he has picked people who he feels most comfortable with, but he has not brought onto the administration before. So you have kind of fresh picks, including the selection of Doug Burgum. Alaska's governor made sense to me because they had been lobbed with 68 executive orders. And I thought, President Trump would reward Governor Dunleavy with a position. But the selection of Doug Burgum is not totally out of left field, and I'm going to explain why. He did have some questionable positions, which we need to talk about. And I think President Trump is not going to allow him to do that. I don't think he's going to push these couple questionable positions he had previously. I don't see that happening, but you have to be transparent. I think it's important to be transparent about some of the questionable stuff he has done. But even in spite of that, I could be more trustful of Doug Burgum versus Deb Haaland, because Deb Haaland totally destroyed the credibility of the Department of Interior. She alienated hunters. She just palled around with drag queens who were making a mockery of park rangers. She was putting eco-grief sessions greenlighting eco-grief sessions at the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is unheard of. Closing 60 million acres to caribou hunting in Alaska. Gradual lead phase-outs at select national wildlife refuges. whenever opening new hunting and fishing opportunities on public lands, 30 by 30, closing off 40 million acres to new multiple use opportunities to prepare these monuments to become permanently protected for national parks, warping the Antiquities Act, not allowing hunters and anglers to have a seat at the table as much. Yes, there was a council, but you can talk to anyone behind the scenes when they were crafting different rules, like putting climate change as the first priority over wildlife refuge governance. You even saw center-left people in the conservation space get very angry. So there was a lot of trust destroyed, a lot of politicization of even the Department of Interior, which is not supposed to be the most controversial agency, save for maybe the BLM whenever it's Democratic administrations. So Doug Burgum, who is an avid sportsman, he calls himself a conservationist, coming into the Department of Interior is extremely refreshing. There are a couple positions of his from the past that kind of irk me, and some in the grassroots will similarly question if he was the best pick. But even accounting for this, I think he would still be significantly miles ahead better than Deb Haaland. But let's address kind of the elephant in the room about some of his positions that he's taken, including him supporting controversial carbon pipelines in the Dakotas. These are not oil and gas pipelines. These are a little different. There's been a lot of controversy in South Dakota over this and some other states. And so I don't think he's going to be greenlighting carbon pipelines on public lands, BLM lands in particular, when he takes this position. At one point, he committed to putting North Dakota on the path to carbon neutrality, kind of similar to the Biden position, but he did not take an approach that would discourage the use of fossil fuels. I'm not sure why he took this. Net zero does not work. Carbon neutrality will never be achieved. ESG, environmental, social, and governance investing practices are on their way out. 18 months since everyone said, well, you have to agree with it. It's inevitable. This is what's going to be guiding investment, policy, and the like. It's on its way out. It's almost on its last limbs. But in this interview with Future Farmer, interestingly enough, Governor Burgum was asked more generally, why is carbon neutrality important? He responded, to grow and diversify North Dakota's economy, we must be able to attract capital to our state. And currently, so-called ESG principles, short for environmental, social, and governance, are being used on Wall Street to both guide and restrict investment decisions. Funds that use ESG principles captured over $51 billion of net new money from investors in 2020. In addition to continuing our tradition of solid environmental stewardship, this presents huge economic opportunities and increased economic activity benefits all North Dakotans through job creation, demand for goods and services, and tax revenue to support government services. But while he was kind of flirting with ESG and this notion of going carbon neutral, taking a state carbon neutral by an arbitrary deadline, he was not against fossil fuels. So I don't know how you could hold both positions, because you're either for continued use of fossil fuels or carbon neutrality, not both. But I think he will clarify his statements, especially if more conservative members of the Senate are going to ask him questions about, are you really fully unyoked from these views, or did you say this just because of the audience you were speaking to? Burgum also sold one of his businesses to Microsoft founder Bill Gates. And Bill Gates, when Burgum was running for president, gave him $100,000 to his political campaign. They're known to be and having a cozy relationship. So some people will not like that. Myself included, that relationship is questionable because Bill Gates has been pushing synthetic beef and has some other weird environmental positions. He's great on nuclear. I'm glad he understands that. But is he going to keep Bill Gates at bay with his position at Department of Interior? Will he no longer use ESG principles? Has he gotten over or reconsidered ESG? Like I said, he was very soft on ESG and somewhat on carbon neutrality, not as aggressive as people on the left are. Again, he caveated his support by saying you still need to ramp up production of oil and gas. So very interesting, maybe tactful position, or perhaps intentionally confounding, brilliant, ingenious. I'm not sure. But I have no doubt any of our suspicions or concerns will be quelled and abetted when he takes the helm of Interior. If he really wants to make an impression, and I think he will listen to stakeholders. I think he will bring back hunters and anglers, really listen to that perspective, because he's an avid bow hunter and not just someone who wants to develop and open up more oil and gas leases to development offshore and onshore across the United States, specifically from the Gulf of Alaska all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. President Trump does not want to have offshore wind. Does Doug Burgum go along with canceling pending or future offshore wind projects across the Atlantic seaboard? I hope he does, because there is so much evidence to support that is not environmentally friendly. It is harmful to the whales. We have talked about this. I've cited a letter from a NOAA fisheries scientist, Sean Hayes, who warned the Biden administration in May 2022 that offshore wind development and construction has deleterious effects on endangered North Atlantic right whales. It's not some invented conspiracy. There is a lot of support behind this. Does Burgum cancel the Western Solar Plan? I'm led to believe he will. Will he ensure that these fraudulent Inflation Reduction Act clean energy projects not get built up, solar and wind on BLM lands, cancel some of those existing agreements because they're never going to be built? I would like to see him take an axe to Lava Ridge and a couple of the other wind projects we have talked about here, but also this Western Solar Plan, which will allow for the catalyzation of almost or over 30 million acres of BLM land across 22 states. That's unheard of. That's a horrible plan. Horrible use of land, does not produce reliable energy. And then you could just say, I'm virtue signaling and we're moving away from fossil fuels, but you're not moving away from fossil fuels because ironically, fossil fuels back up these very inefficient so-called clean energy projects. Burgum also being from North Dakota, Western state. I was going to mention that earlier. It is important that an interior secretary have some ties to the West. He does not come from a state with much of public land. Nevertheless, I think he is a conservationist, and even people on the left who've worked with him at the state level have said he does have an attentive nature to conservation since he's a sportsman. Firearms organizations, Safari Club, many other groups that you've heard about or we've brought onto the program here have praised his selection. They believe he's going to restore common sense to the agency, even relating to sportsmen and women issues. He's not going to be selling public lands to the highest bidder. I don't think he will. I hope he also does not entertain this notion of opening up public lands to affordable housing. And definitely we do not want to see public lands like it was being toyed with under the Securities and Exchange Commission. They were going to be greenlighting natural asset companies to gobble up private and public lands. We've talked about this at length with Margaret Byfield of American Stewards for Liberty. I don't want to see that direction either. I think Burgum will bring some balance because he knows a lot is on the line. Americans love public lands. What has been problematic is this deviation from multiple use management of public lands, which allows for multiple uses. I will go down to support this. I will criticize Democrats when they betray this. I will even criticize Republicans, my fellow conservatives, who want to potentially sell public lands or do that. I've consistently maintained this, and I don't agree with selling of public lands. I think they should be managed better, and you can hold that view as a conservationist and still believe in property rights. I absolutely believe in property rights. I don't want to see those infringed upon either. There has to be a balance between public and private cooperation, management. Here's how I know President Trump is not going to greenlight the selling of public lands. Sometimes he says some crazy stuff, bizarre stuff, as a way to, generate sound bites, what have you, in terms of affordable housing on public lands or freedom cities, which are pretty preposterous. Those are never going to be greenlit under public lands. You will not see that happening. I don't see incoming secretary or secretary-elect designate Burgum greenlighting such a thing because you would anger people. You'd anger conservatives if you sell off public lands. Come on. If you want to lose the Western conservative contingent, that is a surefire way to do it because people don't want these affordable housing policies to creep into their backyard. Rural areas do not have this. You can alleviate housing problems, as I talked about before, through different means. Do not bring the problems of the cities and suburbs to rural areas, especially those where BLM, Forest Service, and national park lands are. So even with some of the positions that Burgum has taken, I think he would still be more workable and amenable to true conservation aims. And I don't think he supports climate alarmism. I don't get that from him whatsoever. And so maybe he can do some trust building, or maybe he can meet with people who are perhaps a little distrustful or maybe skeptical of some of his past positions and reassure them that, hey, I'm not for net zero. Hey, I'm for sportsmen and women. I'm not going to be selling off public lands. I'm not going to be doing this. So he fits kind of into the traditional mold of what an interior secretary is. At least he does the activities. He's worked more so in energy. Again, he's going to be also leading this National Energy Council to really supercharge energy development with this final selection that we're going to go into detail about. I'm very excited about this one too. And I think it's actually the first time, some others have pointed out, it's the first time we have someone who actually worked in the energy industry, not some bureaucrat or some lackey. Someone who actually has experience dealing with oil, gas, nuclear, all forms of energy. That is with the selection of Chris Wright, who is the CEO of Liberty Energy, a Colorado-based company. I remember 3 years ago, and for some reason I forgot his face, and I'm usually good with remembering people's faces and names, but he came to the defense of a midstream oil and gas company called Innovex Downstream Solutions when North Face denied them an order for 400 corporate jackets because they said, we don't want to have any products, or we don't want to promote fossil fuels, even though all those fabrics and materials are petroleum byproducts. So Chris Wright and his company helped to lead this campaign called Thank You North Face. And I remember that, and I've heard from different friends who've had more close interactions with him. They've told me wonderful things about him, that he really is about energy abundance. He has this energy abundance mindset. He's a humanist. He's not a climate alarmist. And in fact, he rejects wholly and concretely net zero. He and Doug Burgum have also worked very closely together, which is why you're going to see them co-lead this National Energy Council. So again, even with some of the questionable, some past positions that Burgum has taken, I think him working with Chris Wright is going to balance out whatever he may have shortcomings in with steering away energy and natural resources issues from net zero, climate alarmism, ESG, DEI, all this nonsense that really, really set back these policies across the last 4 years. And a little into Chris Wright's background, in addition to him really exposing how hypocritical North Face is, he kind of is regarded as an American shale boom pioneer. So the shale boom that happened in the 2000s, people have considered him as one of the leaders of such a movement. He's a fracker, likes oil and gas, wants to see more of it. He will definitely orchestrate the pumping and exporting of more so-called molecules of freedom, coined by his predecessor, Rick Perry, who was also governor of Texas at one point. And a little bit different from Department of Interior. Everyone's like, well, Department of Interior handles oil and gas leases onshore and offshore, which is true, but they don't handle nuclear. So Mr. Wright is going to have nuclear under his portfolio and in the nuclear stockpile of weapons, nuclear weapons stockpile, more specifically. And while we are shoring up natural gas, coal, you're going to see coal brought back too, because coal is still one of the largest energy sources consumed globally. People don't know this. But even after years of regulation, people tarnishing the source, and there was even a court case earlier this year that rebuked an Obama era rule that really stymied the development and harnessing of electricity from coal. So coal will make a comeback too, and it's not something to be afraid of or nervous about. We want to have as much reliable sources as possible. But this supercharging of nuclear is going to be extremely pivotal, I think, because we're trying to eat at the competitive edge that our adversaries, Russia and China, have in this space, because we had so much red tape, we had so much misinformation about nuclear for the longest time, for decades, that we're so behind. We could have been on the offense. We as a country pioneered nuclear technology with the Manhattan Project and such. But somehow our adversaries have run with it because we had environmentalists sue to stop these projects from coming online. We had misinformation. We had fears following the Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island disasters, even though Chernobyl was a Soviet failure, not a nuclear energy failure. So I think Mr. Wright, or Chris Wright, is going to have a very big task to kind of humanize nuclear more. And I think he will, judging off of what I've seen about him. I also think the selection of Chris Wright is going to irk. It's partly trolling, but he is an effective selection. But I like that he has point blank said there is no climate crisis and we're not in the midst of an energy transition either, which is true when you look to see how countries are positioning themselves energy-wise and companies. They are pivoting back to fossil fuels. They're starting to do more nuclear projects. Here in America, I'm arguing through my work at IWF and here on the podcast, we're soon to be in the midst of a nuclear energy renaissance because we have to cut at that competitive edge that our adversaries have. You're going to see more small modular reactors, microreactors, private innovation in the space. You see more investments being done in the name of nuclear energy. And Chris Wright and Doug Burgum leading this National Energy Council. Once we get more details, I think we're going to analyze it more succinctly and give concrete details. But it really is to shore up domestic energy production, to cut our reliance on foreign adversaries who produce all these different commodities in a really irresponsible way. And it's also more expensive to import that really dirty energy here. Why would we do that? Why are we taking more steps when we could do it here at home when it's cleaner? It's produced in a very safe way. You're not having questionable labor practices involved, and why not boost the environment too? What we do here, we're going to protect the surrounding areas where these projects are with conservation, true conservation practices. And I don't talk about foreign policy here, but I think when you have more domestic energy production, something I'm going to try to articulate in my policy work too, you have more peace around the world. And this is good for our national security. Why would we be reliant on China for rare earth elements when we have so many deposits in Alaska, Minnesota, some of the other Western states, Arizona, where you could safely mine for rare earth elements for things beyond EVs or EV batteries? We need rare earth elements for a lot of other tech. Additionally, as I alluded to earlier, something that the Department of Energy tackles as well are these energy efficiency standards for household appliances. Most of the rules that have been crafted have fallen under the purview of Department of Energy, and their enactment into final rules, pending litigation or pending the change of administration, it is estimated that a lot of these new regulations, which are premised in being climate friendly, green, what have you, the average American household is slated to pay $9,000 more annually to retrofit their homes like this. And this is not even accounting for installation costs and other upfront costs that are very expensive. And when you analyze each of the so-called cost savings of these DOE so-called energy efficiency standards, the cost savings are paltry and embarrassingly low. Why would you pay thousands of dollars higher upfront costs to only save maybe $100 annually on your expenses? Like, what is this, Common Core math? So-called climate savings, they have to restructure how these energy efficiency rules are done because there's no such thing as climate savings. Climate savings are bunk, especially when you tabulate high upfront costs with couple $100 of savings across the lifetime of this new green-friendly appliance. It's a joke. You don't have to be a mathematician to see that this computation, this calculation makes no sense. So you're totally destroying your house with unknown appliances that work less, consume more water, consume more electricity, and then you're ultimately going to pay more, and that so-called savings will be negated. It's mind-blowing and crazy what they were proposing and propagating across these 4 years. I did the numbers. I did the computations for you. I am not the only one. There were other groups out there, plenty of center-right environmental groups that also calculated the numbers and equally found that this is troublesome. Also, I think Chris Wright is going to divest himself from his business holdings, unlike Jennifer Granholm. Jennifer Granholm had a conflict of interest with Proterra electric buses, so I think he's going to be smarter and divorce himself. I think all these three picks will divorce themselves from any potential conflicts of interest. In general, with these three picks, I will say, even with some of their shortcomings, maybe lack of experience, or maybe a couple questionable positions, I will say my initial preening into all three, Zeldin at EPA, Burgum at Interior, Wright at Department of Energy, I'm a lot more confident with this crew than I am with Michael Regan, Deb Haaland, and Jennifer Granholm. At least these three can be held accountable. I have no doubt I will be interacting with them and their staff across the next 4 years, professionally speaking, maybe getting them to come on the podcast. I would love to talk to all three on the podcast. I haven't done interviews with either of the three whatsoever, but I think it'd be good to have them on the podcast so they can speak directly to the listeners and the American people about these more wonky environmental, energy, and conservation topics. I think they would like the platform too, so we're going to work on that as well. But in my professional capacity and hopefully on this podcast, we will hopefully get to sit down with these three individuals, their staff, and get to know what they're going to be prioritizing, what's on their mind. But I can take comfort in knowing that these selections will be pretty decent. They'll be able to be held accountable, and they are responsive to public pressure, unlike this administration. The last administration, unless you had robust opposition, they would not change any rule. I think these three will be a lot more responsive to concerns of the public if anything were to go one way or another in the extreme. So you'll be able to see more accountability. You'll be able to see more responsiveness. That's kind of my takeaway in this episode. I want to know what you think. If you want to learn more about all three individuals, I've included links at the show notes for you all to digest and explore for yourselves. But I hope that was a good summary of these three top picks to helm the EPA, Interior Department, and Energy Departments, and the new National Energy Council. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.